Okay, so we will discuss the experimental design. So we've discussed non-experimental uh, design regarding um, surveys and observational methods. So now we'll go over experimental designs as well, which we will not actually conduct in this class, but it's important to understand nonetheless to delineate between experimental and non-experimental designs. So first and foremost, confounding variables, which will play a role in non-experimental designs as well, but we'll discuss them here. So a confounding variable is something that varies along with the independent variable. And so this is something that we may not be able to identify during our experiment or during our experiment, but is going to impact the dependent variable without us knowing. So it occurs when the effects of the independent variable and an uncontrolled variable are intertwined. So this could potentially be another variable that we're not accounting for that is actually causing the dependent variable to vary. And we can't determine which variable is actually responsible for the observed effect on the dependent variable. And so we cannot come to any really causal sort of conclusion. But if we have good experimental design, we can eliminate as many of the confounding variables as possible that could result in other explanations for why the dependent variable varied. So when we can confidently attribute, um, or when results can confidently be attributed to the independent variable causing the effect in the dependent variable, we can say that the experiment has high internal validity. Now, this is going to be a little different than the non-experimental design because it's much harder to control for confounding variables in the non-experimental design, but within experiments, it's easier to control as many variables as possible because it's in a very controlled environment. Thus, there is higher internal validity within experiments. So, when we're talking about experiments, there's a couple of different designs. A researcher can use a post-test only design. And so in order to use this, there needs to be two equivalent groups of participants. The dependent variable is going to be manipulated, which is going to occur in all experiments. And we measure the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. Now, there's also selection differences, and this is where there are systemic differences between the participants assigned to each group. This has to be avoided, in that, if we are conducting an experiment and we would put just males in one group, females in another group, those would be major selection differences that are going to affect the outcome of the experiment, and we need to avoid that. And thus, that's why randomization comes into play. But with a post-test only design, what that means is that you're going to recruit your participants, conduct the experiment, and then determine the results or collect the data. On the other hand, there's a pretest and post-test design that people can use or researchers can use. And this is where there's a pretest test given before the manipulation occurs on that independent variable. So it's going to allow researchers to see if the groups are actually equivalent at the beginning of the experiment, which is not controlled for in a post-test only design. Um, but if participants are selected randomly in most cases, uh, and if the sample is sufficiently large, you don't necessarily need to do that because a large sample in randomization decreases the chances of that selection bias, and thus a pretest isn't necessarily required. But if that's not necessary, if that's not the case, a pretest would be helpful to determine, okay, do we have equivalent groups here? All right, so compare and contrast these. A pretest post-test design, the pretest allows us to see whether the groups are equivalent, whether the control and other group are equivalent, whether the change can be incorporated into the analysis of group differences and of individuals. Also, the effects of attrition or mortality. So this is attrition and mortality have to do with participants dropping out or not completing the experiment. And so the pretest does allow for the assessment of the effect of this. But there are disadvantages because it is going to be time consuming, and it can sensitize participants to what's actually being studied. But you can mitigate this by disguising the pretest. So there are advantages and disadvantages to this. Um, okay, so again, now we have the Solomon four group design. This is the experimental and control groups are studied with and without a pretest. So half of the participants are going to receive only the post-test, and the other half are going to receive both the pretest and post-test. And so if there's no impact of the pretest, the post-test scores will be the same in the two control groups and in the two experimental groups. So there is this design as well that can be used to ensure that both groups are equivalent. And here's where you can see this as well. And then the examples of outcomes of this four-group design, which you are hoping for. Now, assigning participants to experimental conditions. So again, you're going to have a control and an experimental group, but let's talk about these designs first. So in the independent groups design, this is when participants are randomly assigned to the various conditions so that each participates in only one group. So this is also known as a between subjects design because the comparisons are made between different groups of participants. So as a participant, you're only going to either be exposed to, let's say, the placebo effect. Let's say we're doing a antidepressant related study. Half of the participants are going to get a placebo, half are going to get the antidepressant. And that is it. You get one or the other. Whereas if you would do a repeated measures or within subject design, all participants are in all conditions. Now, again, that's going to be useful in certain types of designs, but giving my example again, that would mean that participants will get both the placebo and the antidepressant, regardless of what group they're in. Everybody gets every condition. So those are the two types of designs used within experiments. And also, again, I cannot emphasize the random sampling method enough when it comes to experimentation. But with the random assignment, this is the decision about which group each participant is assigned to. It's completely random. It's not controlled by the researcher, and it prevents any sort of biases from the researcher or the experiment in general. It's going to yield equivalent groups because that randomization is going to enhance that equivalency, and it removes participant differences as an explanation for results, thus decreasing bias. So again, that random assignment, the randomization of your sample is going to increase that internal validity, decrease any biases. Now, the repeated measures design. Okay, so and again, when it comes to this is the within subjects design. Everybody gets exposed to every condition. The advantage is you don't need as many participants, and it's extremely sensitive to statistical differences. Now, the disadvantages is the order effect. The order of presenting the treatments affects the dependent variables. So one group, let's say, gets the placebo first and then the antidepressant, and the other group gets the antidepressant and then the placebo. So the order in which those occur can actually affect the overall outcomes. There's also the practice effect. This is where performance improves due to the practice gained from previous tasks, or there's additional information that participants have, which can affect the reports that they give. There's the fatigue effect as well, in that participants, if they are exposed to many tasks, again, because they're going to be exposed to every condition, they can get bored, distracted, just tired of participating. There's also the carryover effect. This is when the first treatment carries over to influence the response to the second treatment. So let's say a group got the antidepressant first and they noticed some effects, and then they got the placebo second. They still might report effects that were the result of that antidepressant, but are not reminiscent of the effect of the placebo. So those are all disadvantages of using that within subjects design. Also, there's counterbalancing. This is a method of controlling four-order effects by either including all orders of treatment presentation or randomly determining the order for each subject. Again, that randomization decreases the bias. But then, in going back to that example, you might have participants have the placebo first, then the antidepressant, but then you also expose them to having the antidepressant first and then the placebo. That way, they experience both orders of conditions. There's also the Latin square. This is a limited set of orders constructed to ensure that each condition appears at each ordinal position, and each condition precedes and follows each condition one time. Again, making sure that every order is presented to participants. And you can see these orders here. Okay, when it comes to a repeated measures design, again, that's going to again be the within subjects. Oops, oops. Researchers also need to carefully determine the time interval between the presentations of treatments and possible activities between them. So if you have maybe a rest period, that might counteract a fatigue effect and kind of counteract any effects that might carry over from that first exposure. And like we were talking about with the antidepressant, if treatments involve the administration of a drug or some sort of emotional changes, you might need a long time interval because, again, any effects of like an antidepressant may take time to wear off. I mean, you might even be talking about months between the administration of like an antidepressant and then a placebo. Repeated measures designs, there are two major advantages over the between subjects design, and it's a reduction in the number of participants. You also have greater control over participant differences and greater ability to detect an effect. And some real world situations are comparable to the independent groups design, while others may be more reminiscent of the repeated measures design. So you might be able to decide whether you want to use a between or within subjects design based upon how it would reflect what actually happens in the real world. And experiments that produce relatively permanent changes in individuals cannot use those repeated measures designs or that within group because, again, the effect isn't going to wear off and you can be exposed to another condition. We also have the matched pairs design. This is where participants are matched based on a participant variable, and the matching variable will either be the dependent or something that is strongly related to it. So the members of each pair are then going to be randomly assigned to the different conditions of the experiment. This can make sure the groups are equivalent, again, decreasing bias, which is particularly important with small sample sizes, which can introduce major aspects of bias because there are not enough people to eliminate differences between groups. And because matching procedures, they can be costly, time-consuming, it's not commonly used in the experimental design. I have never taken a course in which this design is actually used. It's been either within subjects or between subjects designed primarily. So that was just a quick overview of the experimental design. Again, if you have any questions, concerns, you just let me know. And I hope you have a wonderful day.